it's funny because I think a lot of people obviously know them now, having been married for a long time and having kids, and 4 grandkids who are all here as well. But not many people know about how this actually all started.
How they met?
How they met. Is this okay? Can we tell this story?
Talk about it?
That was not a very reassuring yes.
But to see over the iPad.
But you know, my parents, they're both immigrants, and I think the immigrant story is probably a story that a lot of us share in this room one way or another. And my mom was living in Oklahoma, going to school there, and this is the mid-1960s, and she wore a sari every day to when she was going to school, which I thought was remarkable because I think in Oklahoma today they still don't wear sari. So mid-1960s is pretty remarkable. But she finishes her degree in engineering and decides that she's going to go to a place where the jobs are, which was Michigan, right? So,
you want to be an engineer.
She wanted to be an engineer. So she's driving across. She's driving across the state, and she's driving towards Dearborn, Michigan, and she's on her way to becoming the first woman engineer hired at the Ford Motor Company, which is pretty remarkable in and of itself. But ironically, her car breaks down. Future first woman engineer, car breaks down. And so, you know, again, it's the mid-1960s, your car breaks down. You're an immigrant from the other side of the world. It's a bit daunting, and you don't have any friends, you don't have much money, you just have a broken down car. So what do you do? What do you do? So she decides to go to the phone booth, because they had phone booths back then, and she tries to find any Indian sounding name. You go back to your roots. So she finds a name, and what was it? Was it Patel, I think? Patel's a pretty common name, so I think that's...
See, the way that I tell the story, it's Agarwal, because it's A's, you start with A, but, you know, it could have been Patel, maybe Shaw. You can interchange.
None of that matters, though, because the person she was trying to call was not home, did not answer. But the guy's roommate answered the phone, who is our father. So the fact that Sunil and I are here at all is a total fluke. Total fluke.
Mr. Patel was out on the town. It turns out.
But my dad was also an engineer, and he, you know, it's funny because we went back a couple years ago because I wanted to see the exact spot where this happened, where the phone booth was. It's no longer there. And my dad added a part to the story, which I did not know. Maybe you don't know this either. But from where my mom calls, and he answers the phone, and she says, you know, my car is broken down. He asks where she is, and it turns out where she was a place that he could actually see from his 13th floor apartment down. So he kind of looked down there and said, yeah, I'll be down there. I'll come help you. She was driving a 64 Nova, red. Somehow that's the first detail my dad still gives me on this story. I said, what about the woman who was driving it? No, it was a 64 Nova. Love that car.
Well, you know, we should start from the beginning. Here's what I'm thinking for this time. There's a lot of information out on Google about you, and a lot of things that people can read. So why don't we talk a little bit about things that aren't easily discoverable and searchable on Google? How does that sound? Yeah. Let's start near the beginning then. Let's talk about why you decided to become a doctor.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think people have all sorts of different reasons for pursuing whatever they pursue, and sometimes, as we just heard, it can just be serendipitous. You know, I didn't come from a medical family. I think a lot of people who go into medicine do it because they're exposed to medicine through their family in some way. For me, I think a lot of it had to do with when my mom's father got sick and he was in the hospital. For some reason, that had a real profound impact on me. We were very close. I ended up spending time with him in the hospital. He had a stroke, and I was 12 or 13 years old, I think, pretty young at the time. And I remember thinking that the doctors who were caring for him were just these really remarkable people. And I'd ask them these questions, and they would take time to answer my questions. And it sort of dawned on me, I think, for the first time that there was a profession where that was what you did. You essentially, you trained to be able to take care of other people. And I had never really understood that as a concept for a job or for a calling or a career or whatever. And I think that's where it really started. So it started pretty young for me, I think. And then I went through various iterations of sort of what sort of medicine I wanted to practice specifically. But I think that was really the moment where I thought this could be something that I could do for the rest of my life.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about family a lot in the reporting that you do. You wrote a blog post recently. If people haven't checked it out, it's a really good one, actually. It's probably the most personal I've seen you get in a blog post. And you get pretty personal sometimes, and you can bring your story into it. And it was called When Your Patients Are Your Family.
Yeah.
You published it on Medium. And one of the lines that stuck out to me is that, you talked about sort of our family history. And one of the things you said in there is, quote, "A doctor can change your life, but not the way that you live."
Yeah. I was really sort of struck by that, I think, because of you and because of my parents. I think that we, as doctors, it's sort of a holy grail, I think, sometimes to think that we can change our patients' behaviors. And I think, in part due to a lot of the work probably from some of the people in this room even, we're making greater strides toward that. But it's a challenging thing to do, to change people's behaviors, even if they're your own family. Sometimes it's harder with your own family. I mean, because they don't always listen to you as a medical person, they're still looking at you as a relative, and they may or may not take your advice. But Sunil, when he was quite young, so we're 10 years difference in age, and when he was pretty young, he did not take good care of himself. He overate a lot. It's hard to believe now when you look at him because he's such a healthy guy and so svelte, but he was very overweight. He talks about this openly, to the point of obesity.
I like Twinkies. Twinkies were...
Hostess would have gone out of business about 10 years earlier had it not been for...
That's right. I was keeping him alive.
But I came home, and it was interesting because I was training in neurosurgery, and I was taking care of patients, and I sort of was at home one day, and I realized how things had gotten completely out of control within my own family. And I remember I was sitting at the kitchen table once, and my mom would buy some of these Hostess treats, but she would put them on the highest sort of shelf in the pantry closet because he was only 6 or 7 years old, I think, at the time, so he couldn't reach them. And
I still can't reach them.
Yeah. And I watched him. He didn't know I was watching him, but I watched him as he literally stacked 2 stools, stepping stools, one on top of the other, reached up there, grabbed 2, I think, packages of Hostess cupcakes, ate them both while still precariously balancing himself, threw the wrappers back up there, and came back down.
I'm glad we're going into such detail about this.
There was a lot of detail. It was a little shocking, and it was a little heartbreaking as well. And I realized that a part of why he was doing it, part of the reason a lot of people do it, it was not because he necessarily needed to eat 4 Hostess cupcakes within 10 seconds, but it was a comfort measure for him in some way. There was other things going on in his life that were probably driving this, and no one really had paid attention to that for him, I think. So I remember for some time I thought about this, and then I started replacing the food up there without you sort of knowing it, replacing it with healthier food. And then I watched you do the same thing again with the balancing of the stools and the reaching up there, and then you kind of looked at it and you're like, I don't care, eat it anyways. But now you're eating healthier food, and it was a simple sort of change in your environment that I think led to some good things. I won't take full credit.
I think it's funny because you're watching this from a distance, and it almost seems like a lab rat experiment. What will happen if I replace this Twinkie with a thing? What's the reaction? Oh, interesting. Taking notes. This is the development of young Dr. Sanjay Gupta. So
that was actually not my first experiment on you.
That's great. Nobody ring a bell in here. No bells. So you're talking about behavior change, and one of the things that always strikes me about some of the articles and some of the things you share is that oftentimes people get the care that they need, and oftentimes people in this room are involved with that care, but sometimes it happens at a moment that is unfortunate. There's a trigger that they need to get to in order for that care to sort of set in. So part of what you do, I think, is to have a conversation with people before that moment.
Yeah.
But that's a really hard conversation to have.
That's right. I mean, people don't want to pay attention to things unless they're literally hit right in the face with whatever is happening. So to get people to sort of imagine what the future might be like is a lot of what I think we have to do as doctors, but also I think as journalists. We want to tell these stories, but we want to make sure that people actually pay attention to them even before it happens, so it has more relevance. But it's challenging, and I will tell you that when you think about medical messaging overall, it's not a particularly inspiring message. Like if you take the idea of prevention, which is what a lot of the discussion has been around with regard to healthcare moving forward, with regard to lowering costs moving forward, you're basically trying to do something that is nearly impossible to do, as I have found, which is to say to someone, if you do these things, if you eat right, if you exercise, then nothing will happen to you. You're trying to get them to prove a negative. It's a really challenging thing to do. And then if someone stays healthy, they say, well, how do I know that it was the exercise and the good nutrition, or maybe I'm just a healthier person? How do you know? It's hard, which is why I think a lot of the messaging has to be more inspirational and aspirational. So if the message instead says, we're not going to just prevent disease, we're going to make you better than you thought you could be. We're going to optimize you in some way. We're going to make you happier, more productive, more joyous. We're going to make you the best that you can possibly be. So this notion of diagnosing, treating disease on one end, preventing disease sort of in the middle, and then optimization sort of on the third tier, I think is a really healthy way of looking at things. And we focus a lot on optimization. I think if a patient feels like they are being optimized in some way, they're much more likely to carry through on whatever is being told to them. From a television and journalism standpoint, they're much more likely to listen as well and pay attention to these messages. So I think that's what we try and focus on.